It's strange how life can seem so steady, so predictable, until one day it cracks wide open and you realize you've been living with blinders on. That's how it felt with Michelle. We had been married for 12 years, built what I thought was a strong foundation, and started a family together. Our daughter, Clara, was the best thing to ever happen to us. Funny, curious, and full of life. I thought we were a team, but in hindsight, maybe I ignored the signs because I didn't want to believe they were real. At first, the changes were small, almost insignificant. Michelle started coming home later than usual, blaming work deadlines and client meetings. She was always driven, one of the things that had drawn me to her when we first met. Back then, her ambition was magnetic. Now, it was exhausting. She would come home drained, barely offering more than a hi, before retreating to the bedroom or burying herself in her phone. In her phone, God, if I had paid attention to her phone sooner, maybe I wouldn't have been so blindsided. She never used to care where it was, leaving it on the counter or by the couch. Then, out of nowhere, it became glued to her hand. She started keeping it face down, silencing notifications, and tucking it away the moment I walked into the room. "Why are you so jumpy about your phone?" I asked her one night. She laughed, a hollow sound that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's nothing, Jake. Just work. You know how my boss is. Always sending emails at all hours. Trust me, it's boring." I wanted to trust her. I wanted to believe that the woman I'd married wouldn't lie to me. But then there were other changes, things I couldn't explain away. She started dressing differently, nicer, more polished. Expensive blouses, tailored skirts, heels that made her legs look a mile long. At first, I thought she was just taking more pride in her appearance, maybe to feel confident at work. "You look great," I told her one morning as she adjusted her necklace in the mirror. "Thanks," she said, barely glancing at me before heading out the door. But I couldn't ignore how rare it had become for her to dress like that for me. When was the last time we'd gone out for dinner? Or shared a bottle of wine after Clara went to bed? The lingerie was the final straw in the what the hell is going on department. A few months earlier, she'd bought several sets, silk, lace, the works. I was excited at first, thinking she was spicing things up for us, but they never made an appearance. Not once. Then there were the early mornings. Michelle claimed she'd joined a new gym across town to de-stress. "It's yoga and spin classes," she explained. "It's helping me clear my head." Yet, I couldn't help but notice that the tension in her shoulders never seemed to ease, and she wasn't any more relaxed when she came home. Still, I pushed the doubts aside. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was all in my head. After all, we had Clara to think about, and I didn't want to stir up trouble over nothing. I reminded myself of all the good years we'd had, all the moments when I was sure Michelle loved me. But as the weeks went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living with a stranger, someone who was slipping away from me, one lie at a time. Looking back, I wonder how I let it get that far without confronting her. Maybe I was scared of what I'd find. Maybe I thought ignoring it would make it go away. But the truth has a way of revealing itself, whether you're ready for it or not. The truth hit me on a Thursday. Funny how ordinary days have a way of becoming extraordinary for all the wrong reasons. Clara had come down with a fever at school, and I'd left work early to pick her up. Michelle didn't answer her phone when the school nurse called her. Something about that already felt off. Usually, Michelle was hyper-responsive when it came to Clara. But that day, nothing. When I got to the school, Clara was curled up on a bench in the nurse's office, her cheeks flushed, her eyes glassy. I brought her home, tucked her in a bed, and made her some soup. As I sat at her bedside, watching her sleep, I decided to check on Michelle. Maybe she was caught up in a meeting and hadn't seen her phone. I called her again, straight to voicemail. I sent a text, no reply. It wasn't until Clara asked for her favorite stuffed bunny, which she'd left in the living room, that everything unraveled. I went to grab it, and as I reached down to pick it up, I noticed Michelle's work bag tossed carelessly on the couch. Her laptop bag was open, and her phone sat inside, charging. My heart sank. If her phone was here, where was she? I told myself not to jump to conclusions. There could be a reasonable explanation. Maybe she was at the gym, like she'd said. But then I saw the notification light blinking on her phone. I hesitated. Checking her phone felt like crossing a line, but something inside me, Call it intuition or sheer desperation, pushed me forward. I unlocked the phone. The messages were right there, glaring back at me like a slap to the face. A string of texts from Greg A. Greg A. Can't stop thinking about last night. You're amazing, Michelle. You make me feel alive again. I needed that so much. Greg A. Same time tomorrow? Michelle? Of course. I'll make it work. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My hand started to shake, my vision blurred. And for a moment, I thought I might throw up. My wife, my Michelle, was having an affair. And not just with anyone. Greg Allen, her boss. I scrolled further. Pictures. Not explicit, but damning enough. A selfie of them at some hotel bar. A blurry shot of Michelle in what I now realized was one of her new lingerie sets, taken in a mirror. She looked happy, carefree in a way I hadn't seen in years. Except she wasn't smiling for me. My mind raced. How long had this been going on? How had I not seen it? Clara stirred in her bed, pulling me back to reality. I couldn't fall apart. Not yet. Not with my daughter in the next room. I closed Michelle's phone, set it back in her bag, and tried to calm myself. My heart was pounding, my chest was tight, and every nerve in my body screamed for answers. But there was no denying it anymore. Michelle was lying to me, sneaking around behind my back, and I was left standing there, holding the truth like a live grenade. I sat on the couch, staring at the phone. The text burned into my memory. I wanted to scream, cry, smash something, anything to release the anger and betrayal coursing through me. But I didn't. Instead, I sat in stunned silence, replaying every moment from the last few months, every late-night meeting, every gym trip, every excuse she'd given. It all made sense now. The guarded phone, the new clothes, the distance between us. It wasn't paranoia. It was real. And now I had to decide what to do about it. Michelle came home late that evening, just as I knew she would. She walked through the door with her usual work was crazy expression, kicked off her heels, and gave me a quick peck on the cheek. She didn't even notice how tightly I was gripping the edge of the kitchen counter, trying to hold it together. "How's Clara?" she asked, her voice casual, as though the ground beneath us wasn't about to split open. "She's sleeping," I replied, my tone flat. Michelle paused, sensing the tension. "Everything okay?" I turned to face her, my heart pounding. "Is there something you want to tell me?" Her brows furrowed. "What are you talking about?" I took a deep breath, the words clawing their way up my throat. "I know about Greg, Michelle. I saw the messages. I saw the pictures." The color drained from her face. For a moment, she just stood there, her mouth opening and closing as though searching for the right words. "Jake, it's not what you think." "Not what I think?" I snapped, my voice rising. "So, you're not sneaking around behind my back with your boss? You're not meeting him in hotels, wearing lingerie you bought for him? Explain that to me, Michelle. Make me believe it's not what I think." She tried to respond, but the words came out jumbled, incoherent. I didn't mean for this to happen," she finally said, tears welling in her eyes. It just got complicated. I've been feeling so." "Don't you dare," I interrupted, my voice cold. "Don't you dare stand there and tell me this is about your feelings. You had a choice. You could have talked to me. You could have told me you were unhappy. But instead, you chose this. You chose to betray me, to destroy everything we built." She started crying then, the tears streaming down her face. "Jake, I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't mean for it to go this far." "You didn't mean for it to go this far?" I repeated bitterly. "What exactly did you mean, Michelle? Was this just some fun little game for you? Something to make you feel alive again?" She didn't answer. She just stood there, sobbing, looking more like a guilty child than the woman I thought I knew. The anger inside me burned hotter with every second of silence. Was he worth it? I demanded. Was Greg Allen worth throwing away your family? Your marriage? "I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. That broke something inside me. I stared at her, the woman I had loved for over a decade, the mother of my child, and realized I didn't recognize her anymore. This wasn't the Michelle I married. This was someone else entirely, someone who had made a choice to put her own desires above everything we had. "I want you to leave," I said finally, my voice firm. She looked up at me, shocked. Jake, no, please. Don't do this. We can fix this. We can. There's nothing to fix. I cut her off. You already broke it. Get out. She hesitated, searching my face for any sign of forgiveness, but she didn't find it. Jake, I love you, she said desperately. I laughed bitterly. You don't get to say that. Not anymore. For a moment, I thought she was going to fight me on it, but then she turned and walked upstairs. I heard her moving around, probably packing a bag. I stayed in the kitchen, staring out the window into the darkness, my mind racing with everything I wanted to say but couldn't. When she came back down, her suitcase in hand, she stopped in the doorway. I'll call you tomorrow, she said softly. I didn't respond. I couldn't. When the door closed behind her, the house fell silent. And for the first time that day, I let myself feel the full weight of what had happened. Anger, sadness, betrayal. It all crashed over me like a wave, leaving me gasping for air. The life I thought I had was gone, shattered into a million pieces. And all I could do was try to figure out how to pick them up. That first night after Michelle left, I sat on the living room couch in complete silence. Clara was still asleep upstairs, blissfully unaware of the chaos unraveling beneath her feet. I stared at the blank TV screen, clutching the throw pillow like it was some kind of anchor, my mind spinning in 100 directions but somehow going nowhere at all. I felt hollow, like someone had reached inside my chest and ripped out everything I thought I knew about my life. The anger that had fueled me during the confrontation faded, leaving behind something far worse, an ache so deep it felt like it might split me in half. Betrayal is a strange thing. It doesn't just hurt, it shifts the ground beneath you. You question everything, not just about the other person, but about yourself. How did I miss this? How could I have been so blind? Was I not enough? These questions hammered at me, each one cutting a little deeper than the last. Sleep was out of the question. Every time I closed my eyes, images of Michelle and Greg played on an endless loop in my mind. Her smile, the one I used to think was meant for me, now haunted me, directed at someone else. I couldn't escape it. By morning, I felt like a ghost of myself, running on fumes and sheer willpower. Clara woke up still feeling under the weather, so I called in sick to work to stay home with her. I made her breakfast, tucked her back into bed, and tried to focus on anything other than the wreckage of my marriage. But every little thing reminded me. The wedding photo on the mantel, Michelle's favorite mug sitting in the sink, the scent of her perfume still lingering in the air. I caught myself standing in the kitchen, staring at that mug, tears streaming down my face before I even realized I was crying. I hated her in that moment. Hated her for what she'd done, for how easily she discarded everything we had. But beneath the hate was something even worse, love. That was the cruelest part. I still loved her. Despite everything, my heart hadn't caught up to the reality of what she'd done. It was like my brain was screaming, "She doesn't deserve your love," while my heart whispered, "But she's still the mother of your child, the woman you built a life with." By the time Michelle called that afternoon, I was too drained to answer. She left a voicemail, her voice cracking as she apologized again and begged me to talk to her. I didn't delete it, but I didn't listen to it again either. I spent the rest of the day alternating between taking care of Clara and trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. Did I want to save the marriage? Could I even forgive her if I tried? Or was this it? The end of the road for us? The answers didn't come that day, or the next. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in this limbo forever. I had to do something, but first I needed to pull myself together. For Clara, if nothing else. She deserved a dad who could keep it together, even if everything else was falling apart. Over the next few days, I operated on autopilot. My focus was on Clara, who was still recovering from her fever. Taking care of her gave me something to hold on to, something that made me feel grounded when everything else seemed like it was spinning out of control. Michelle kept calling and texting. I ignored most of them. When I did read her messages, they were all variations of the same theme: apologies, explanations, and promises to fix things. She said it was a mistake, that it didn't mean anything, that she didn't want to lose our family. But every time I thought about responding, I'd hear Greg's name in my head or see one of those texts again, and the anger would bubble back up. I wasn't ready to talk to her. Not yet. I didn't even know what I would say if I did. So I focused on practicalities instead. The first thing I did was call my friend Eric. Eric had been my best friend since college, the kind of guy who always knew how to cut through the noise and get to the heart of a problem. When I told him what happened, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Jake," he finally said, his voice heavy. "I don't even know what to say. That's messed up, man." "Yeah," I replied, rubbing my temples. "It is. What are you going to do?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but I need to figure it out. For Clara, if nothing else." Eric didn't hesitate. "Whatever you need, I'm here. Seriously, you're not going through this alone." And I didn't feel alone, at least not in that moment. Having someone in my corner gave me a little bit of strength, a reminder that I wasn't entirely adrift. The next step was practical. I needed to protect myself. I called a lawyer, something I never thought I'd have to do. Sitting in that office, explaining my situation to a stranger, made everything feel even more real. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Karen, listened patiently as I told her about the affair and my concerns about Clara. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, her expression calm but serious. "You're doing the right thing by coming here," she said. "First, we'll talk about documenting everything. Do you have proof of the affair?" I nodded, feeling a pang of humiliation as I admitted, her phone. "I saw the messages. I took screenshots." "Good," Karen said, jotting something down. "Keep those. And any other evidence you might come across. I know this is painful, but the more we have, the better position you'll be in if this goes to court." Court. The word felt like a punch to the gut. Was it really going to come to that? Karen must have seen the look on my face because she softened her tone. "I know this is overwhelming, but right now, your priority is Clara. If you decide to move forward with a divorce, we'll make sure her needs are at the center of everything." Her words stuck with me long after I left her office. Clara. She was the only thing that mattered now. Whatever happened between me and Michelle, I had to protect her from the fallout. That night, after Clara went to bed, I sat in the quiet of the living room and stared at my phone. Michelle had sent another message. "Michelle, Jake, please. Let's talk. I know I messed up, but we can fix this. I love you. I love our family. Please don't give up on us." I read it over and over, trying to decide if I felt anything at all. Did I want to save our marriage? Did I even believe it could be saved? The answers didn't come easily. All I knew was that I needed time. Time to think, time to breathe, time to figure out what came next. For now, I wasn't ready to talk to her. Not yet. But I knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed felt like a blur, a strange mix of numbness and pain that came in waves. I kept myself busy with Clara, throwing myself into work, cleaning the house, anything to keep my mind from circling back to Michelle. But the quiet moments, the ones when Clara was asleep, or I was alone in the car, those were the hardest. Every time I closed my eyes, the betrayal replayed in my mind. The texts, the photos, the lies. I found myself questioning everything. Was our marriage ever real? How long had Michelle been lying to me? Was I just some blind fool, oblivious to the cracks in our relationship? The worst part was the self-doubt. I started replaying every argument we'd ever had. Every time she seemed distant or annoyed. Was this my fault? Had I driven her into Greg's arms? Maybe I wasn't enough of a husband, enough of a man. Eric called every couple of days to check on me, and I appreciated it more than I could say. But I couldn't bring myself to tell him how lost I felt, how much of this I was blaming on myself. He'd probably tell me I was crazy, that this was all on Michelle, not me. But it didn't feel that simple. Then there was Michelle. She kept calling, texting, leaving voicemails. I ignored her at first, but eventually I listened to one. "Jake," her voice cracked through the speaker. "I don't even know where to start. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know how sorry I am. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to. God, I don't know how to explain it. Please, can we talk? For Clara's sake, if nothing else. I can't lose you both." Her words twisted something in me. For all my anger and pain, I couldn't deny that I still cared about her, that some part of me wanted to believe her, to find a way to forgive. But then I'd think about Greg Allen, His smug face, his texts, his audacity to step into my life and take what wasn't his. And the anger would flare up all over again. It was an emotional tug-of-war, one I felt like I was losing. One night, after putting Clara to bed, I sat in the living room with a bottle of whiskey and tried to make sense of it all. The silence of the house was deafening. The emptiness a constant reminder of everything I'd lost. I poured myself another drink and stared at the photo of us on the mantel, the three of us smiling at the beach last summer. Michelle's arm was around me. Her face lit up in a way that seemed so genuine at the time. I wondered if she was already seeing Greg then. Was she lying to me even in that moment? I didn't have any answers, just more questions. And I was tired of asking them. By the time I went to bed that night, I made a decision. I wasn't ready to talk to Michelle yet. Not really. But I needed to take control of the situation. I couldn't let her dictate the terms of this mess. Couldn't let her apologies or explanations cloud my judgment. Tomorrow, I would start making moves. I'd meet with Karen again, lay out a plan for what came next. I'd figure out custody for Clara, secure my finances, and prepare for the inevitable fallout. Michelle had made her choice, and now I had to make mine. For Clara, for myself, for whatever life I still had ahead of me. It was time to stop wallowing in the pain and start building something new. Even if I didn't know what that looked like yet, it had to be better than this. It had to be. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. It wasn't peace. Not yet, but it was resolve. Michelle had made her decision when she crossed that line, and now it was my turn. If I was going to protect myself and Clara, I had to focus on what mattered, getting my life in order and figuring out what came next. I called Karen, my lawyer, and scheduled a follow-up appointment. This time, I came prepared. I brought the screenshots from Michelle's phone, a copy of our financial records, and a list of questions that had been building in my head since the night I confronted her. Karen was professional as always, but there was a slight edge to her voice this time, something that told me she'd seen this story play out more times than she cared to count. "Jake," she said, flipping through the documents I'd provided, "you're in a good position to take control of this situation. You've got clear evidence of infidelity, and you're taking steps to protect your daughter. That's the most important thing." She went on to outline the process: filing for divorce, arranging temporary custody agreements, and securing my assets. Every step felt like another nail in the coffin of my marriage, but I knew it was necessary. "Do you think she'll fight me on custody?" I asked, the thought of a drawn-out battle tightening a knot in my chest. Karen leaned back in her chair, considering. "It's possible, but in my experience, most cases like this don't go to court. If Michelle is truly remorseful, as you've described, she may want to avoid putting Clara through any unnecessary stress. But," she added, her tone firm, "we're going to prepare as though she will. That way, you're protected no matter what." As much as I hated the idea of dragging this out, I felt a small flicker of relief. At least now I had a plan, something to focus on besides the endless cycle of anger and pain. After leaving Karen's office, I took the afternoon off work to spend with Clara. We went to the park, just the two of us, and for the first time in days, I felt a sense of calm. Watching her laugh as she raced down the slide, her curls bouncing in the sunlight, reminded me why I was doing all of this. Clara didn't know what was going on yet. She was too young to understand the complexities of adult relationships, but she could sense the tension. She'd asked about Michelle a few times, wondering why Mommy wasn't home. Each time, I gave her a vague answer about work or errands, knowing I couldn't shield her forever. That evening, after I tucked her into bed, I finally replied to one of Michelle's messages. "We need to talk. Not about us, but about Clara. Tomorrow night. I'll let you know what time." The response came almost instantly. "Michelle, thank you, Jake. I'll be there. I promise." Her eagerness to talk made me feel both angry and exhausted. Part of me wanted to unleash everything I was feeling, to make her feel the same pain she'd inflicted on me. But another part of me knew that wouldn't solve anything. I stared at the message thread for a long time before putting my phone down. Tomorrow would bring another confrontation, but this one wasn't about revenge. It was about boundaries, about setting the terms for what came next. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I reminded myself that this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about Clara and the life I needed to build for her. One step at a time, I told myself, one step at a time. The next evening, after Clara was in bed, Michelle came over. She knocked lightly, almost hesitantly, and when I opened the door, she stood there looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced by red-rimmed eyes and a tentative expression, as though she expected me to slam the door in her face. "Hi, Jake," she said softly. I stepped aside, wordlessly letting her in. It felt strange seeing her in the house after everything. She looked around, her gaze lingering on the familiar space, as if she were taking stock of what she'd lost. "Thank you for letting me come over," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Don't thank me," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I'm not doing this for you. This is about Clara." Her shoulders sagged at my words, and she nodded. "I know. I'm so sorry, Jake. I can't say that enough." I held up a hand to stop her. "This isn't the time for apologies, Michelle. I didn't ask you here to rehash everything. We need to talk about Clara and how we're going to handle things moving forward." She bit her lip, her eyes glistening. "Of course, whatever you think is best." I motioned for her to sit at the dining table, keeping a careful distance between us as I sat across from her. I had written out a few notes earlier that day, points I wanted to cover so I wouldn't get sidetracked by my emotions. "First," I began, "Clara doesn't know what's going on yet, and I'd like to keep it that way for as long as possible. She's already picking up on the tension, and I don't want to make it worse by dragging her into this." Michelle nodded quickly. "I agree. She doesn't need to know about what happened." "Second," I continued, "I've spoken to a lawyer. We're starting the process of filing for divorce." I paused, letting the words settle in the air. "It's not up for discussion." Michelle flinched, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. "Jake, I'm not here to argue about that." I interrupted, my voice firm. "This isn't about us anymore. It's about Clara. She deserves stability, and that's what I'm going to give her." She took a shaky breath, nodding. "Okay, what do you need from me?" "We'll need to work out a custody arrangement," I said. "For now, Clara will stay with me. You can visit her, but I need to know that you're going to prioritize her needs. No distractions. No lies." Michelle's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded again. "I'll do whatever it takes. I just want to be there for her." For a moment, the conversation stalled. Michelle looked like she wanted to say more, to explain or defend herself, but I didn't give her the chance. "There's one more thing," I said, leaning forward slightly. "I need you to understand that it's over. I can't forgive what you've done, Michelle. Maybe one day I'll stop being angry, but I'll never forget." Her face crumpled at my words, and for a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered the texts, the pictures, the betrayal that had ripped my world apart. "I understand," she whispered. I stood, signaling the end of the conversation. That's all I needed to say. "I'll have Karen send over the paperwork once it's ready. If you have questions or concerns, you can talk to her." Michelle rose slowly, looking like she wanted to say something more, but thinking better of it. She walked to the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. "I know you don't believe me," she said quietly, "but I really am sorry, Jake. For everything." I didn't respond. She looked at me one last time, her eyes full of regret, before stepping out into the night. As the door clicked shut, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The conversation hadn't been easy, but it felt like a step forward. For the first time, I felt a sliver of control over my life again. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The day after Michelle and I talked, I felt an odd mix of emotions: relief, sadness, anger, and a strange sense of closure. It was as though the conversation had solidified everything I'd already been feeling. There was no going back, and while that thought hurt, it also gave me a strange kind of freedom. I threw myself into routines to stay grounded. Mornings became about Clara, making her breakfast, packing her lunch, walking her to school. I'd never realized how much of her day-to-day life I'd missed while working late or assuming Michelle had things under control. Now, it was just the two of us, and I was determined to be there for her in every way I could. Clara seemed to sense the change. She didn't ask about Michelle as much, and when she did, I kept my answers simple. "Mommy is staying somewhere else for a while. I told her one morning as we walked to school. But she loves you very much, and she'll come see you soon. Clara nodded thoughtfully, her small hand clutching mine. Okay, Daddy. Her acceptance broke my heart a little. She deserved a stable, happy family, and now she was caught in the middle of something she couldn't possibly understand. But her resilience amazed me. Kids have a way of adapting, even when adults struggle to do the same. Meanwhile, I was slowly adjusting to life as a single parent. I learned how to braid Clara's hair for school, figured out her favorite snacks, and discovered that she loved bedtime stories as much as I enjoyed reading them to her. Those moments, small as they were, became the highlights of my day. Work became my second refuge. Diving into projects kept my mind busy and gave me a sense of accomplishment that I desperately needed. My coworkers noticed that I seemed more focused, though they didn't know the reason behind it. I wasn't ready to share my personal life with them. Not yet. Then there were the evenings. Once Clara was in bed, the house felt too quiet, too big. I'd sit in the living room, staring at the same walls Michelle and I had decorated together, the same furniture we'd picked out. It was hard not to feel her absence, even though I knew it was for the best. Michelle stayed true to her word and didn't push for more than what we discussed. She saw Clara a couple of times a week, and while those visits were brief and supervised, they seemed to go well. Clara was always excited to see her mom, and I made sure to put my feelings aside so she could enjoy that time without tension. But despite the progress, there were still moments when the anger bubbled up. I'd see her text or think about Greg Allen, and the betrayal would hit me all over again. It wasn't just the act of cheating, it was the lies, the deception, the sheer disregard for everything we'd built. Eric, ever the loyal friend, became my sounding board during those moments. One night, as we sat on his porch drinking beers, I let it all out. I keep asking myself what I did wrong. I admitted what I could have done differently. Eric shook his head, his expression serious. Jake, this isn't on you. I know it's hard to believe, but Michelle made her choices. You didn't force her to do this. I know, I said, staring at the bottle in my hand. But it still feels like I failed somehow. Like I wasn't enough. Listen to me, Eric said firmly. You're one of the best dads I know, and you did everything you could in that marriage. Some people just screw up. It's not about you. It's about them. His words stuck with me long after I left his house. Maybe he was right. Maybe this wasn't my failure, but hers. That night, as I lay in bed, I made a promise to myself. I couldn't change the past, but I could control the future. I would focus on Clara, on building a life that felt whole again, even without Michelle in it. It wouldn't be easy, but I owed it to myself and to Clara to try. As the days turned into weeks, the initial chaos began to settle. Life didn't feel normal, not yet, but it felt manageable. I started developing a new rhythm, one that revolved around Clara and keeping things as steady as possible for her. Mornings were my favorite part of the day. Clara would shuffle into the kitchen in her pajamas, her hair a wild mess, and insist on helping me make breakfast. Pancakes were her specialty, even though most of the batter ended up on the counter. Those moments, as simple as they were, gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. Evenings were still tough. Once Clara was in bed, the silence of the house felt overwhelming. Sometimes I'd sit in the living room and stare at the empty seat on the couch where Michelle used to sit, lost in thought. Other times, I'd pour myself a drink and scroll through my phone, trying to avoid the memories that lurked in every corner of the house. Michelle was keeping her distance, respecting the boundaries I'd set. She came over to see Clara a few times a week, always punctual, always polite. I kept the interactions brief, civil but distant. Each visit was a reminder of the life we'd lost, but also of the life I was determined to build without her. One evening, after Michelle had left, Clara asked a question that caught me off guard. Daddy, are you and Mommy mad at each other? I froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. I crouched down to her level, meeting her curious eyes. Why do you ask, sweetheart? She shrugged, playing with the hem of her shirt. You don't talk to her much, and she doesn't stay for dinner anymore. I sighed, feeling the weight of her observation. Sometimes grown-ups don't get along as well as they'd like to, I said carefully. But that doesn't change how much we both love you. That will never change. Clara nodded, seeming to accept the answer, but her question lingered in my mind long after she went to bed. I realized then how important it was to strike a balance. Clara deserved to feel loved and secure, even in the middle of this mess. And as much as I wanted to shield her from the truth, I knew the day would come when she'd have more questions, harder ones. That thought propelled me to keep moving forward. I started looking into therapy, both for myself and for Clara. I knew I couldn't navigate this alone, and I wanted her to have a safe space to express herself. The therapist I found, Dr. Wells, specialized in helping families through transitions like ours. My first session with her was eye-opening. She asked questions that made me think about my role in all of this, not just as a betrayed husband, but as a father trying to rebuild a stable home. "What do you want your life to look like a year from now?" she asked me during our second session. I hesitated, caught off guard by the simplicity of the question. "I just want Clara to be happy," I said after a moment. "And I want to feel whole again." "That's a good goal," she said, smiling gently. "And it starts with focusing on what you can control. You can't change what happened, but you can decide how you respond to it." Her words stuck with me. They weren't groundbreaking, but they felt like a reminder of something I already knew deep down. I had to keep moving forward one step at a time. That evening, I sat down at the dining table with a notebook and started making a list. Goals, plans, little things I could do to start piecing my life back together. Some were simple, organizing the house, cooking more meals from scratch. Others were bigger, finding a way to make new memories with Clara, building a life that felt like ours, not a shadow of what used to be. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was steering the ship instead of being tossed around by the storm. The days after starting therapy felt lighter, like I'd finally begun climbing out of the fog that had surrounded me since discovering Michelle's betrayal. There were no miracles, no overnight transformations, but for the first time in months, I felt like I had a direction, a purpose beyond just surviving each day. Clara, as always, was my anchor. She didn't know how much her little routines, her excitement over a new bedtime story, the way she insisted on picking her own mismatched outfits, kept me grounded. I found joy in her laughter, in her silly knock-knock jokes, in the way she still wanted me to tuck her in every night. But life wasn't just about routines and Clara. I knew that if I wanted to truly move forward, I needed to address the loose ends that still lingered, the pieces of my old life that refused to let go. One of those loose ends was the house. It was impossible to walk through it without feeling like Michelle's presence was etched into every corner. The couch where we used to watch movies, the kitchen where she loved to experiment with recipes, even the bedroom. It all felt tainted, weighed down by memories I couldn't shake. I decided it was time to make some changes. Nothing drastic, just small steps to make the space feel like mine again. I rearranged the furniture in the living room, swapped out the old curtains for new ones, and packed away the framed wedding photos that still sat on the mantel. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about creating a space where I could breathe, where I didn't feel haunted by what was gone. Eric came over one weekend to help me repaint the living room. As we worked, rolling a fresh coat of light gray onto the walls, he asked, "So, how are you holding up?" "Really?" I paused, leaning on the roller handle. "Better," I admitted. "I mean, it still hurts, but I'm not stuck in it anymore. Therapy's helping, and focusing on Clara. That helps too." Eric nodded, his face thoughtful. "That's good. You're doing the right thing, man. You're handling this better than most people would." "Doesn't feel like it sometimes," I said with a wry smile. He grinned. "Hey, you haven't burned anything down, so you're already ahead of the curve." We both laughed, and for the first time in a while it felt genuine. The changes to the house weren't just physical. They were symbolic, a way of reclaiming my life piece by piece. I even started tackling little projects I'd been putting off for years. Fixing the squeaky hinges on the front door, building a bookshelf for Clara's ever-growing collection of books. And then there was the garden. Michelle had always been the one to take care of it, but now it was my turn. I didn't know much about gardening, but Clara loved the idea of planting flowers together. So we spent a sunny Saturday afternoon digging in the dirt and planting marigolds and daisies. As we worked, Clara looked up at me, her hands covered in soil. "Do you think Mommy will like the flowers when she visits?" The question caught me off guard, but I nodded. I think she'll love them, I said. Clara smiled, satisfied with my answer, and went back to patting the dirt around the base of a daisy. That moment stayed with me. It was a reminder that no matter how complicated things were between Michelle and me, Clara still saw her as her mom, and I had to respect that. By the end of the weekend, the house felt a little brighter, a little less weighed down by the past. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step in the right direction. And for the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could create a life that was worth looking forward to. Months passed, and life began to take on a new rhythm. It wasn't the life I had envisioned, but it was one I was learning to accept and even appreciate. Clara and I had settled into our little routines, and the house no longer felt like a museum of broken promises. It felt like ours. Michelle and I maintained a careful distance, communicating only about Clara. Her visits were consistent, and while I still felt a pang of bitterness when she stepped through the door, I reminded myself that it wasn't about us anymore. Clara deserved to have both parents in her life, and I was determined to give her that. Therapy continued to be a lifeline for me. During one session, Dr. Wells asked, "What do you think moving on looks like for you, Jake?" I thought about it for a long moment before answering. It's not about forgetting what happened. I don't think I ever will. But it's about finding peace with it, I guess. Accepting that life isn't perfect and that things fall apart, but that doesn't mean you can't rebuild. That's a healthy way to look at it, she said, nodding. And how are you feeling about the possibility of new relationships in the future? The question caught me off guard. I hadn't even considered dating again. It felt like too much too soon. I don't know, I admitted. Maybe someday. But right now, my focus is on Clara and making sure she feels safe and loved. Dr. Wells smiled. That's a solid foundation to build on. Her words stayed with me. For the first time, I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living, slowly but surely. One evening, Clara and I baked cookies together, a tradition we'd started to make Friday nights feel special. As the kitchen filled with a warm scent of chocolate and sugar, Clara looked up at me and said, "Daddy, are we happy?" The question caught me off guard, but I smiled and crouched down to her level. "What do you think, sweetheart?" She thought for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, I think we are." Hearing those words from her made everything, the pain, the struggle, the sleepless nights, feel worth it. A year after everything fell apart, I felt like a different person. The divorce had been finalized, and while the process had been painful, it also brought a sense of closure. Michelle and I remained civil, even friendly at times, though our conversations were strictly about Clara. One afternoon, Michelle and I met at a coffee shop to discuss some upcoming school events for Clara. It was the first time we'd sat down together outside of the house since the separation. "Jake," she said hesitantly as we wrapped up the conversation, "I just want to thank you for everything you've done for Clara and for being patient with me. I know I don't deserve it." I studied her for a moment, noticing how tired she looked. She had clearly been carrying her own weight of guilt and regret, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of compassion. "You're her mom," I said simply. "No matter what happened between us, I'll always want what's best for her." Michelle smiled faintly, her eyes glassy. "I hope you find happiness, Jake. You deserve it." I nodded, offering her a small smile. "I hope you do too." As I walked out of the coffee shop, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly, but it was something close, an acknowledgement that we were both human, flawed, and trying to navigate a difficult situation. That evening, as Clara and I sat on the porch watching the sunset, I realized that I didn't feel weighed down anymore. The pain, while still there, had dulled to something manageable. I wasn't just moving on, I was moving forward. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about what the future might hold. Not just for me, but for Clara and the life we were building together. It wasn't the ending I had imagined, but it was a new beginning. And that was enough.